All right, I think we're recording. I believe everybody that said they would be here is, and others can come and go when they can get on later. I went ahead and muted everybody, and I've turned off your video just to preserve some of the bandwidth to make sure we get a smoother presentation. But thank you for showing up, and I'm really excited to try out this webinar presentation on Zoom call. So this is the first time I've done one of my live presentations as a Zoom call. I'm excited to try that out. And yeah, I appreciate you showing up. I'm excited to go through this. What I want to do, the purpose of this, not only is to talk about this mastering of communication and content context, but to, I've got some extra noises coming in, I'm trying to figure out how to mute those. But to learn this technology better so that I can use this as a way to share some of the classes and the content. A lot of people after a live presentation ask if there's any way that they can access the presentations in the future. So I'm experimenting with and looking for ways to provide that. So I'm learning the technology and want to use some of the features and go ahead and present this course. So the course will take a little bit more than an hour, but if you need to go in the meantime, then by all means. Appreciate you showing up. So today we're talking about mastering content and context. The mastering content and context, when I think about it, it's a philosophy to improve communication, something that we can use to strengthen relationships and cultivate new learning. So learn more effectively, learn more efficiently. But most importantly, I think is strengthening relationships, and that's relationships either in your friendships or your home life, or relationships in business, or relationships with new people that you meet and you have to interact with for work or for any social event or social reason. So we'll talk about that. Before we begin, what I like to do typically is ask one question of you, and all your mics are muted, so you won't be able to answer this directly on the Zoom call. But if you have a piece of paper in front of you, I ask you, what is one thing that you're grateful for? You can take a moment and think of and write down something that you're grateful for. It can be something simple. You can be grateful just for the sun that came up this morning. You can be grateful for the food that you had a chance to eat today, the clothes that are on your back. You can be grateful for the challenges or the blessings that you've received in your life. So just think of one or two things that you're grateful for and go ahead and jot it down. When we think of things that we're grateful for, it puts us in a better frame of mind, a more positive frame of mind that enables us to learn and understand and comprehend new things, and just generally makes us feel better. So I always like to start presentations by thinking of things that we're grateful for. I believe everybody that's on this call knows me already or has been in a presentation before, but quick recap. So I'm an author, a trainer, a philanthropy activist. Been living in New Bern since 2009, New Bern, North Carolina. I'm retired Marine Corps aviator, so I had an opportunity to serve for a little bit more than 16 years in the Marine Corps. And the highlight of my career was working as a KC-130J pilot, flying C-130s in the Marines, and retired in 2015. Since retiring, I founded a nonprofit called 1 Million Gold. We raise money for an awareness about the global water crisis and partner with organizations to bring creative water solutions to some of the 780 million people that are estimated to lack access to clean drinking water. And I'm also, as I mentioned, work as an author, as a speaker, and as a trainer. There's 2 books that I've published. One's called Charity, the Gift of Giving, where I talk about all the benefits of giving to charity, not just in the typical or traditional sense, but anything that really that we do for the benefit of another person. And the other book is called The Sphere of the First to Happiness and Fulfillment, where I talk about a philosophy and ways to live life in a happier, more fulfilling way. Went to University of Maryland for undergraduate. Somebody always asked what my alma mater was. So University of Maryland for undergrad, and then got a master's degree in real estate development from Auburn University. So why communication? Why talk about communication? When I think of communication and the way that we not only communicate with ourselves, but those around us, I think that there's nothing in life that's more important or that plays a bigger role in defining our life experience than communication. And it can be the way that we communicate with ourselves. It can be the way that we communicate with other people in friendships and relationships, or just in the world around us in general. So if there's nothing that influences our life more, then I find it very important that we spend some time thinking about and learning ways to communicate more effectively. And when we're talking about content and context, as a philosophy for communicating more effectively, I think that I've found nothing in my life that has helped me understand the theory of communication and understand more about why communication can be effective sometimes and break down others than this philosophy of content and context. So that's what I want to talk about today. And that's why I find it so important, because everything that we do is influenced by the way and how effectively we communicate. And of course, being a speaker and an author, communication is something that I think about and focus on all the time. So I think about why communication works and when it works, and why communication sometimes does not work or does not work out the way that we want. So our plan for today, or for this presentation, is to talk about content and context, and what I mean when I say content and context. We'll talk a little bit about a theory of what communication is exactly. What do we do? What are we trying to do when we're communicating with somebody? Some things or some reasons why our communication often isn't as effective as we'd like it to be, and why miscommunication is something that's more common than it should be and easily avoidable. Talk about how we can improve that communication by understanding content and context, how we can become much more effective at communicating, and not only communicating with others, but understanding ourselves and understanding others. And I'll touch on why it really matters. So we talk about how important communication is and how it touches every aspect of our life. But really, for me, there's a reason that communication matters so much more, and we'll touch on that towards the end. And if we have some time, there's a couple of advanced topics that I'd like to cover that kind of takes this philosophy of content and context to a different level. That's what we'll talk about today. So what exactly is content and context in regards to communication? When I think of, the way I understand the word content and context, so content is an idea, it's an image, it's a thought, it's something that we have that's in our mind, something that we want to share, something that we learn, whereas context is really a combination of all the things that we know, that we see, that we feel, and that we understand. And why this is so important is because your context is something that's individually defined for you, and it can change from time to time, but it's everything that you know, that you experience. And if you have a thought in your mind, something that you want to share, an idea that you want to share, that would be a piece of your context. So I often think of context as being comprised of many, many little dots of content, many little data points of content. And our context is defined by us and defines many of the things that we know and understand and the way that we can communicate. So our context is everything that we know and understand. Content, or one idea or one thought or one image that we want to share, would be a very small piece of that content, or context rather. And when we're trying to communicate with somebody, we try to communicate our content, that idea, from our context into theirs. And it might be hard to understand exactly what I'm saying, but we'll clear it up very much as we go through. So content is made up of everything that we believe, the ideas that we have, the experiences that we have, the data that we know, facts, things that we know, information, and memories. So when we have new memories, it expands our context. It expands what it is that we know and understand. After you've been to college, you understand things about college. After you've worked in a certain industry, you understand things about that industry, because it now falls within your context. And our context in general is everything that we know, that we see, and that we can understand about the world around us. When things fall outside of our context, oftentimes we don't see them. When things are outside of our context, we don't understand them, or we're limited in our ability to understand them. So if the Spanish language was something that was in my context, and if I heard somebody speaking in Spanish, then I would understand what they're saying. But if that language was outside of my context, I wouldn't understand. If I was speaking with an engineer and I didn't understand some of the vocabulary that he was using, that would be outside of my context. If somebody was sharing a memory of something that they'd done in the past and it was nothing like I had done in the past, then that would be outside of my context and I wouldn't understand. But visually, I think of everything that we know and that we see and we understand forms this, maybe an amorphous blob, or this shape of context, and our context is individual. As we learn new things, as we experience new things, as we begin to understand new things that we didn't understand before, then our context has the ability to grow or expand as well. As we get older, we know more things about the world around us. We know more information. We've had more experiences. So the things that are within our context, those things that we understand, is much greater. There's an interesting thing about the way our context grows when we're creating new memories. There's a book I read by Joshua Ford. It's called Moonwalking with Einstein. And one of the things that he talks about in there is a theory about how we create memories. And he said, if you don't have elements of a certain memory in your mind, you won't be able to create a new memory. One of the examples I think of is, he says, if you, or suggests that if you were walking on the beach with your father at a young age, that you wouldn't be able to create a memory of walking on the beach with your father if you didn't have certain elements of that memory already in your context. So if you didn't have a memory previous to that of being in sand, or you didn't have a memory previous to that of walking, or of being with your father, or of being near the ocean, then you wouldn't have the context required to create that new memory and for your context to grow. So in a sense, the context grows by piecing together these little pieces of content. If these 4 dots represented pieces of content, you could create a new memory by bridging those or by tying those things together. And when you tied together those elements of the new memory or the new thought or the new idea, then your context, then you can create that memory in your context. You can create that understanding in your context. And when you do so, your context itself will grow. So when you have a new experience, when you take another class, or when you read a new book, your context, everything that you know, see, and understand about the world expands. Therefore, your context expands. When you learn, the first time you take an algebra class, it's outside of your context, but after studying it for a number of years, it's within your context. So therefore, you can know, see, and understand things that are within your context. It's really important to understand context because our context is the limit of our ability to perceive things that we see. If something is outside of our context, we might not even perceive it. If there's one thing I think about is my history in the Marine Corps, my experience with the Marine Corps, and there's many, intricacies, there's many peculiarities, if you will, about service in the Marine Corps, service in any branch of the military, that people that hadn't served in the military wouldn't really understand or wouldn't perceive. And one of the most common places that we see this is when we're watching movies. And if there's somebody that's wearing a military uniform, somebody who, I see it all the time, somebody that's wearing a Marine Corps uniform in a movie, if it's not worn correctly, if the ribbons or the badges or the declarations on the uniform are not properly placed, that's something that I perceive. I notice that right away. But somebody who didn't have the military service or didn't understand the same things that I did about the uniform and about the way that it's worn, they wouldn't even perceive that. They would watch the movie and that wouldn't even register. They wouldn't even perceive it. If you're seeing a movie or seeing a scene of something that takes place in a town that you're familiar with, and there's something that's different about the way that the streets show up, or a store looks different, like you would understand that because the memory of that town or that street would be in your context. But to somebody who wasn't familiar with it, they wouldn't perceive that thing that you saw, or that point, or that intricacy that you saw, because it would be outside their context. Our context is also our ability to comprehend things. Referenced algebra. So if algebra is not something that's in your context, if you don't understand the symbols and the vocabulary and the words of algebra, and somebody were to speak about algebra in front of you, then that would be beyond your context. You wouldn't comprehend what they were saying or what the conversation was about. I have a friend who just the other day had a computer repairman out to his house, and the computer repair guy was trying to tell him what was wrong with his computer. But all the words that he was using were outside of his context, my friend's context. So he didn't understand anything that the gentleman was saying because he just couldn't comprehend the terms and the vocabulary and the references that he was making. So he wasn't able to comprehend it. It was outside of his context. And as we talked about, our context is our ability to remember new things. If you have the data points of a new memory, or if you have the building blocks, if you will, to create a new memory in your context, then that's something that you'll be able to perceive and then remember. If you had never walked on the beach, if you had never walked, if you'd never seen sand, if you'd never been near the ocean, if you'd never been with your father, then you wouldn't be able to create that memory, that new memory of walking on the sand with your father on the beach. So if you don't have the context, then you're not able to create that new memory. And I'll show some examples to show exactly what I mean. So your context is your limit of your ability to perceive things. And anything that is outside of your context is something that you can't perceive. It's kind of hard to see what's outside of this lens that the guy's holding in his hand, because that would represent things that are outside of our context. But if you look through the lens, we can easily see that there is some water, there's some mountains, there were some white clouds against a blue sky, those are all things that were within our context, so we can much more easily see those things that are within our context. The other thing is that if it's not within your context, you have a hard time comprehending it and understanding it. So this slide here says that 2 times 3 equals 6. And pull up a pointer here. If you understand this this terminology, now somebody, my daughter, when she was 2, she wouldn't know what this means. But if you understand simple mathematics, you would know that this means time. And that would be actually be an indication of time. You know that the symbol here is an equal symbol. So you'd be able to read, you'd be able to comprehend that. You would know that this statement is true if you understand this is within your context. So 2 times 3 equals 6. You can perceive it and you can comprehend it. And you can also remember it. So if I were to ask somebody to raise their hand, and we don't need to do this now, but if I were to ask you what that sentence was that you saw, most of us would remember that it said 2 times 3 equals 6, and that's because it was all those elements were within our context. If I were to put a slide like this on the board or on the screen, we certainly see that there's symbols there on the, symbols and letters and other indications of things in white against a black background. But if you're not familiar with calculus and you're not familiar with this trigonometric functions, then you might not understand what any of this means. It would be outside of your context. And if it's outside of your context, then your ability to recall it and remember it is going to be greatly affected. And if anybody could remember all of that on the board, then that would be an indication that those things were well within your context. Here's an example of a simple sentence that says, if you understand this, these words and their definitions are within your context. So if you can read these words, understand what it's saying, then all these words would be in your context. And because it's within your context, you would most likely be able to remember that, at least in the short period of time, what exactly that sentence was and the meaning of the sentence. So it said, if these words and their definitions are within your context, you'll remember this. But if you had other words that may not be in your context, here's a sentence as well. It's as elementary and as simple as the last sentence, but this one's written in Spanish. And it says, si entiende español, estas palabras y sus definiciones están dentro de su contexto. And if you understand Spanish, then you might have recognized that. If you don't understand those words and their definitions, and that was outside of your context, then you'd have a much harder time or an impossible time trying to recall exactly what it said. But it was just a Spanish translation of what the first sentence was. Sometimes we'll experience new things or we'll see new things that are outside of some of our context and we'll have limited comprehension. So maybe we're trying to create that new memory of walking on the beach as a child with our father, but we'd never been on the beach before, or we'd never felt sand or walked in sand before. So some of those data points fell outside of our context. Because they fell outside of our context, we wouldn't be able to recall those. We'd only be able to tie together those points that were within our context. Anytime we have a new experience, there's things that are outside of our context. We likely won't be able to perceive it the same. We won't comprehend it the same, and we won't be able to remember it the same. And everything of that new experience that falls outside of our context is going to be affected by those things, by our ability to see, perceive, and remember or comprehend. Here's a perfect example of something that might be partially in and partially outside of our context. So this here is a sentence that was on the screen earlier, and we might see or recognize some of these things in the context, like there's the equal sign that we're familiar with. Here's the equal sign again. Here's the simple number 1. Some people might recognize this symbol as the symbol for pi and a basic trigonometric sine and cosine. So those might make sense. But the rest of it might fall outside of our context. If you're not familiar with what this symbology means here, that would be outside of your context. And some of this symbolism here would be outside of your context, and you wouldn't understand exactly what this is. You wouldn't comprehend it. You'd be able to see it, but you wouldn't be able to comprehend it. And if I were to change the slide, you wouldn't be able to remember it. The sentence is another example. It says the Fourier series, that's what the equation represents, and it's an infinite series of trigonometric functions that represents an expansion or an approximation of a periodic function used in Fourier analysis. Now, if I were to hear somebody read that, I would recognize many of the words. The word and, the word infinite, the word series, these are words that I'm familiar with, but the use of them, the definitions of them in this particular context is outside of my context. So therefore, I don't exactly understand what that means. And if somebody were asking me to repeat what the Fourier series is, I wouldn't really, my chance of being able to recall that would be very limited if I could do it at all. So these are partially in and partially outside of my context. Therefore, it's harder for me to remember. I can only remember some things. Maybe I'll remember the sentence was the definition for Fourier series, but I won't be able to remember what any of the other words were. So our context is the stuff outside of our context we don't see. So we can often perceive things that fall outside of our context. Many times we'll miss things because they're not within our context. When I think about this, I think it correlates very well to the visible light spectrum in a way. So our context would be everything that we can see, comprehend, and understand. But there's a whole lot of things going on in the world around us that are outside of our individual context. Just like this is an electromagnetic wavelength spectrum, and it shows the many different lengths of electromagnetic energy that are around us all the time. There's only a very small spectrum of that, referred to as the visible light spectrum, which we can perceive with our eyes. So when we look around, we can only see things of the electromagnetic spectrum that fall between this about 380 nanometers, a little bit more than 700 nanometers of wavelength. So everything that takes place around us or outside of that context, we just don't see, we don't perceive, we don't understand. And the microwaves that are traveling around us at all times right now is certainly something that we wouldn't remember seeing or happening or occurring. We can only remember those little things, or the small area that falls within our individual context. So if context is so important, then how do we understand what our context is? And one way we can do this is by thinking back on, doing a little bit of a context mapping exercise, and thinking back on the things, some of the major experiences, major events that have shaped what we know, what we see, what we understand, and how we understand and visualize and interact with the world around us. Every time we have a new experience, every time we learn something new, it changes our context in a way. So when we can think back at some of the things that are shaping our context, if we can answer some of these questions, and I'll leave this on the screen for a few moments if you'd like to answer some of these, but at least read through and reflect on or think about these. All these things are unique to you, and all of these things contribute in some way to your specific context, to your age, your race, your place of birth. These shape everything that you know, see, and understand about the world around you, and how you relate with certain events or circumstances or things that take place around you. So when you think of all these things and how these have shaped your particular context, then you can begin to understand how it is that you see things, why you see things a certain way, and understand all the things that you know and get a sense of some of the things that you don't know. Number 17 says places that you vacationed. If you vacationed in Florida, then there's things that you know, see, and understand about Florida. And if you had a conversation with somebody, there's things that you would know, see, and understand about the conversation when they spoke about Florida. But if you've never been to California and the conversation was about California, then that would be outside of your context. So therefore you wouldn't necessarily know or understand or remember things significant to what it was that they were sharing. So if context is everything that we know, see, and understand about the world around us, then what exactly is content? As I said, content is one of those small pieces that makes up our context. It's the building block, if you will, of the context of your individual context. So it can be an idea that you have. It can be a concept. It can be something that you recall from memory. It can be an image that you have in your mind, or an emotion that you feel, or just some data point that defines something that you know or understand or have learned. But I really think of them as building blocks of our context, because when we learn new things, then it affects what it is, that new content affects how we see the world around us. After you've had that experience of walking on the beach with your father as a young child, then you can correlate that or reference that when creating new memories or when expanding your context in other ways. So this brings up the question of what is communication? I understand communication to be taking one data point of that context that you have that's individually defined to you. Maybe it's an idea that comes up or a memory that you want to share with somebody else. And when you want to communicate that thought or that memory or that idea, then you take that piece of your context and you use communication to share that content with somebody else. And somebody else will see it and understand that content in regard to their own context. Unfortunately, too often when we share thoughts or ideas, or we speak with somebody, the way that they perceive what it is that we said is different than we understood or perceived it or intended it to come out. Here's a cartoon. I'm sure that many of us have been in a situation like this where you have a thought in your head, and then when you try to transmute that into words or vocabulary to express it to somebody else, it doesn't come out the way that you were thinking of it. This girl is thinking that, I know your job is important. Don't worry about me. I can take care of myself. But when she tried to take that idea, that piece of content, and transfer it to the person that she was speaking with her vocabulary, it came out that your job is more important than me. That's cool. And in the context of this situation, we can understand how that might be misperceived or miscommunicated and not be the exact intent that she had or that she was thinking or the idea that she was thinking. And I think this happens too often for many of us when we're trying to communicate how we think or how we feel with other people. If we don't understand how their context is, if we don't see the words that we say in their context, then it can affect the idea or the image that they have in their mind after we've communicated how we understand it on our own. And when this happens, this communication breakdown occurs. And this happens for many reasons. The one reason is just because our best means of communication is not perfect and it's flawed in many ways. We often use nonverbal communication to express ideas or feelings with other people. And nonverbal communication is not universal. So the same nonverbal cues that might mean something to one person don't necessarily mean that same thing to another person. I think of a time when I was in Germany and I was at a bar and I was trying to order 2 drinks. So I held up my hand to indicate the number 2, and I used my index finger, my middle finger, create something much like a peace sign. And the gentleman that was providing the drinks, he looked at me and he had no idea what I was indicating, because in Germany, that 2 is not a recognized expression, or those 2 fingers is not a recognized expression of the number 2. So he had no idea what I was saying, because in Germany, if you want to indicate 2, you typically use your thumb and your index finger. So that was a nonverbal communication that wasn't effective. It didn't effectively communicate the number 2 that I had in my mind. And that's just one example. Another is, culturally, things are perceived differently. I know in our culture, typically in the Western culture, if you were to look at somebody in the eye, nonverbal communication, looking somebody in the eye, that's often a sign of respect or acknowledgement. It's a sign that you're paying attention or that you're engaged. But if you were to do that same thing in most Asian countries, that's not a sign of respect. It's often a sign of disrespect. So if you are intending to show somebody respect and you look them straight in the eye, then you're going to have, it's going to create a different impression in their context than it does in your own. And that's just nonverbal communication. Now, verbal communication is no more perfect and no less flawed than nonverbal communication. When we communicate verbally, we use the vocabulary that we have, we use the words that we have to express the ideas that are on our mind. But even verbal communication, the words that we use aren't universally defined. Even the most simple word, the simple 3-letter word like cat, you would think that you could look that up in Webster's dictionary and there'd be one universal definition of it, and it would be something that if you were to use that word to express an idea, there could be no miscommunication or misinterpretation. But often when we define words in our context, they're not just defined with a definition like what the word means or what the vocabulary word means, but it often comes with many other implications from our context. So a simple word like cat, if I was somebody who grew up with cats in my family, and and I had a cat that I hung out with all the time, and he was my best friend in some ways, then when I heard the word cat, it would create one image or one thought or one emotional response in my body. But if another child grew up and he had, he was a dog lover and he used to run around the neighborhood like Dennis the Menace and torment cats when he was growing up, and that's the definition that he thinks of in his mind, then even that simple word cat, when shared or when used to communicate a thought or an idea, that word cat could have very different meaning or implication in somebody else's context than in your own. Another example would be a word, protection. If I were to talk to a friend of mine who owns a cafe or a retail store, and I said, and I knew that she carried, bags of cash or sums of money with her out in the evenings, and I said to her, you should be careful, make sure that you have some, protection so that nothing bad happens to you. That would have one image or one context. But if I was talking to, a teenager or some college kids and, teenage boys, and I said, make sure you have protection, that would have a completely different meaning and create completely different emotional response and completely different image in their head. But it's the same word that was used to describe something opposite or completely different in a different context. So even these words that we use, they don't carry a universal definition. They don't carry a universal image. They don't carry universal message from one person to another. And that's because of our context. Our context is different. Everybody's context is individual, and the definitions that we ascribe to even the most simple words like cat are relative to our specific context, which is the next point, that content is relative. The meanings that we give to things, the way that we understand things, the way that we understand good, bad, poor, rich, easy, hard, these are all relative to our context and to the experiences that we've had. One person that has grown up in gross poverty their whole life might hear, they have the idea of earning $100,000. That might sound relatively like a ton of money. That might be more than they could possibly comprehend. But if you talk to Bill Gates or to Elon Musk and you talked about earning $100,000 next year, that would have a completely different image or a completely different emotional response in them, because the $100,000 isn't universal. It's the relative value that somebody gives to that or somebody ascribes to that number in their specific context. Here's an example. If I were to ask you, is the blue star big or small? And you were looking at it, you'd be tempted to say that the blue star was big. And I agree that compared to the yellow star, the blue star is big. If I ask you now if the blue star was big or small, well, now relative to the green star, it doesn't look so big. So if this is your context, if that dashed line represents your context, then that blue star wouldn't look big, it would be small. If this was your context, if this was the sum of all your experiences, the information, the beliefs that you had, then you would look at that blue star and you think it was something large. The star hasn't changed. It's just its relative value depending on your particular context. Context or content also depends on an individual's perspective. So the way that things are looked at. Maybe somebody had an event happen to them in their life, and when they look back on that event, something that would be tragic, maybe they lost a house in a fire or they lost a job, they would look back on it and they would think that, that job loss, maybe they see the benefit or the blessing that came from it. Maybe they saw the new opportunity that opened up because they lost their job. Well, they would see that from one perspective and think that it was a good thing. But somebody who is currently going through job loss might not see it the same way, or likely wouldn't see it the same way. It all depends on perspective. There's a demonstration I like to do in live audiences where I have two people look at a beach ball from different sides. And I have them describe the beach ball and what it looks like and what do the colors look like and what order do the colors come left to right. Well, if you're looking at one side of the beach ball, the colors will go from, the beach ball I typically use is a solid color on one side and it has dashes on the other, stripes on the other side. So if you're looking at it from one angle, you would think that it was all a solid color like green. But if you were standing on the other side and looking at it, you would think that it had different stripes or different colors. Well, it's the same beach ball. It's just whether you understand it or see it or perceive it as one or as the other depends on your particular context and your perspective and where you're standing. Another thing about content is it's not absolute. We talked a little bit about the breakdown just from the definitions of basic words, but the meanings that words have also change depending on our specific context. And no content itself, no idea, no thought, no image, no data point, no piece of memory itself has absolute reference or absolute value when compared to somebody else's context. This would be a simple example of 2 + 2 = 4, or 2 + 2 equals, and then if you were to look at that, you'd probably say that 2 + 2 = 4. Well, that's true. But so is 2 plus 2 equals 1 plus 3, and 3 plus 1. And 2 plus 2 also equals 1 plus 1 plus 1 plus 1. All of those are correct. None of those are wrong, but there wasn't one universal right answer. There's no one absolute answer. When we're talking about content, when we're talking about an image, when we're talking about a fact, when we're talking about an idea or an emotion, there is no just plain black or white. It's not always positive or negative. It's not always right or wrong. The content itself doesn't have an absolute value until you correlate it to somebody's context, or until you relate it to something else, or until you identify your perspective. And one reason this is important, and it often leads to the breakdown of communication, is because just because one is right doesn't mean the other one is wrong. Just because 2 plus 2 equals 4 is correct doesn't mean that 2 plus 2 equals 1 plus 3 is wrong. Just because one side of the beach ball is all green doesn't mean that the other side isn't yellow, green, and blue. Just because one idea or emotion is good in one person's context doesn't mean that it's good or bad necessarily in another person's context, like the example of $100,000. So communication breaks down, and if you're taking notes, this would be a good thing to jot down. But communication breakdown occurs because that best means of communication, our verbal and our nonverbal communication, is imperfect and flawed. And the content that we use to describe an idea, to share an idea, that content that is that idea, that thought, that image, that emotion that we have that we want to share is relative to our specific context. And the way that we understand it, the way that we see it, the way that we recall it, all depends on our specific context. It's relative to our context. It depends on our perspective of that information, that content that we want to share. And the content itself is not absolute. If I want to use the word cat, it's not an absolute definition of the word cat. If I want to share it with somebody else, I can't assume that the definition has the same meaning for the other person, because it's going to be relative to their context. And when communication breakdown does occur, we see many consequences of it. One is miscommunication. So as the cartoon exemplified or showed, we see miscommunication. The thought, the idea that we have, the content that we want to share is not communicated effectively to somebody else. And when that happens, we're often left with confusion. You know, if I said 2 plus 2 equals 4 to somebody and they didn't understand that, or they didn't see it that way, well, I'm going to be confused. They're going to be confused. There's too much room for misunderstanding. Somebody might say something and you understand it to be one thing and they understand it to be another thing. And now there's misunderstanding, which can lead to frustration. When you're trying to communicate and your ideas aren't being communicated effectively, you can oftentimes find yourself frustrated. If you're making decisions based on communication and you perceive content to be one way in your context and somebody else perceives it to be another way in their context, and you're basing decisions off that, well, you can often make wrong decisions or bad decisions, or decisions that you wouldn't have made had you understand the context or content differently. When you're making wrong decisions or different decisions than what you would have made, and that can lead to aggravation, obviously. What about in the business life or in relationship life? If communication breakdown occurs, think of how much lost opportunity there is. Lost opportunity for new friendships, lost opportunity for new business opportunities or new experiences. Just think of all the lost opportunity that occurs when communication breakdown happens. So if those are the bad things that happen with communication breakdown, then understanding content and context, what can we do to communicate more effectively to make sure that that communication breakdown doesn't occur? Well, the first thing that we can do is communicate in another person's context. And I love this cartoon. It says, this is how I'm sure many of us often feel. I felt this way myself, that my words came out just fine, that they were processed incorrectly by your brain. Many times we know what we want to say, we know what we're thinking, we know what point of content we want to express, but it doesn't come out that way, and it's misinterpreted, and it leads to those miscommunication, that breakdown, that frustration, that miscommunication, the misunderstanding. And instead of thinking, hey, maybe I could have said that differently, we think of the other person and we tend to blame it or think that it's the other person's fault for not understanding what we were saying. But had we done one thing that's very effective, is speak in another person's context, we could have alleviated a lot of that pain, that frustration, that miscommunication. I think of when I communicate with, with a child, when I communicated with my daughter when she was 4 years old. I understood that her context was different than my own. I understood that her experiences in life to that point had been much different than my own. There were words that she wouldn't understand. There were concepts that she wouldn't understand because it would fall outside of her context. So when I would communicate an idea to her, I would purposely try to pick things that were within her context so that she would understand what it was I was saying. Because I was thinking about her context, not my own, and thinking about the content that she would understand, not the content that I understood when I was communicating with her. I've been to Nicaragua a couple times. I've traveled abroad many times, and when you're speaking with somebody who speaks a different language as their native language, and maybe they speak a little bit of English, well, you understand that their English is going to be limited. So when you're communicating with them, you purposefully use words that you think or that you would assume are in their context. You're not going to use more difficult or more lengthy words. You're going to speak in very basic words so that you ensure you're picking words, or you try to ensure that you're picking words that are within their context, because it makes the communication more effective and less room for that communication breakdown to occur. So if we're talking to somebody and we want to communicate something with them and we're going to use ideas that are outside of their context, they're not going to understand anything. If we're using all those mathematical jargon or those symbols that were on the screen before and it's completely outside of our audience's context, and they're not going to remember, they're not going to perceive, they're not going to understand or comprehend any of it. If we use some content, some ideas that are within their context, partially within their context even, then we'll start to understand some of those things and remember and recall some of those things. If we want to communicate most effectively, the way to do it, as I would do with my daughter, is I would pick words that I knew were within her context so that she would understand what I was saying. Now, it's really easy to understand that example, but it's no less different. My context is no less different than anybody else's that I might be communicating with. I think a lot of times we'll think of that, we'll look at somebody and they might be of a similar age or of a similar background, and we'll use words that are perfectly defined in our context, but don't make the same sense or don't have the same relative value in their context. But because we're the same age, because we come from a similar background or the same country or live in the same state, we I think assume too much that people's contexts are much more similar to our own, but they're not. We can't make that assumption, and we shouldn't have that assumption that anybody else's context is anything like ours, because through that context mapping exercise, we see all the things that are different. We see all the ways that our context is shaped, and we see the many different elements that there are that lead into or that influence our context. So when I'm talking to even somebody that I share an office with or somebody that I meet on the street, I've got to remember that their context may or may not be anything like my own. So the more that I can learn about them, the more effectively I can understand their context, the more effectively I can communicate, the more accurately I can communicate with them. One exercise I like to do to explain this is an exercise to make us think more analytically about the words that we're using and kind of translate or alter the words that we use to make it to increase the likelihood that the words are in somebody else's context. One way that we can do that, and just to practice doing that, is the 5-letter word exercise. And what I like to ask people to do, what you can do, jot down, or you can do it later. You can think of, I want you to describe what you did and what you ate for dinner last night. And when you're describing it, as you write it down or as you explain it to somebody else, don't use any words that are longer than 5 letters. So if I wanted to say, I walked down the street and ate at a seafood restaurant and, and had an appetizer and a dinner. Well, many of those words are longer than 5 letters. So now if I need to transform that so that I'm using, something that only has 5 letters, then I would have to say, I wouldn't even be able to use the word walked, because that would have too many letters. So let's see, I took the street to, 2 blocks. I think all those are less than 5 letters, and ate at, I can't think of anything for restaurant, but I wouldn't be able to say seafood because that would be too long, but I could say, had food from sea, And I think you get the point, or you see the example, is that if you're not really thinking about the words that you're using and how it's coming out and trying to shape it in a certain way, then you can just too easily or too quickly start saying things that are not in somebody else's context. Once again, when I'm speaking to my daughter, I'm consciously trying to think of words and concepts and ideas that are within her context to help her understand it better. And it's no different than this example for this exercise of trying to say everything in 5-letter words. As the thoughts and images are coming to my mind, I've got to pick only words that are 5 letters or shorter. And if I'm speaking to somebody else that doesn't have my same context, I've got to pick content that is within their context to give them a greater chance of understanding it. One way that we can do this, so sometimes we need to share things or content with somebody and it is outside of their context. So one way that we can do that is by using examples or using metaphors or making analogies or comparisons to things that we think are within their context or know that are within their context to help them understand. So I wanted to share a story of what it was like living in the desert in Afghanistan for a couple of months, and I could use examples, I could use analogies or make comparisons to things that I knew somebody who hadn't been to Afghanistan would understand. Or so maybe I'd say, the temperature and the environment was a lot like it is in, the Western United States or in Arizona or in Southern California away from the ocean. It's very dry and dusty. So if somebody had been to a place out in California away from the ocean towards the desert, then they would see and they would understand that and they'd be able to perceive that by using that example. A lot of times we like to use sports examples when we're sharing an idea or a concept that somebody else might understand. Maybe two football fans or two football fanatics, they can make correlations to things that they're trying to share. They can make correlations to how it would relate to something in football or how it would relate to something of a common context between the audience and the speaker. So if we're to use bridging, this is one way I kind of visualize it, is I'm taking something that's outside of my recipient's context and I'm going to find some way to bridge it to something that's in their context by explaining it in terms that they understand. Maybe I know that the person loves football, so I make analogies to things that they would understand from the game of football. Or maybe I know that the person I'm speaking to loves fishing, so I make analogies to how what I'm trying to describe relates to or correlates to fishing. Here's a quote that I love by Nelson Mandela. He says, if you talk to a man in a language that he understands, that goes to his head. If you talk to him in a language that he understands, then he'll comprehend what you're saying. It goes to his head. If you talk to him in his own language, that goes directly to his heart. If I bridge a concept when I'm talking to my daughter and I use ideas that I can explain to her through bridging, through metaphors, through explanations, through examples, that's one thing. But if I talk specifically in her own language, if I talk specifically in her context, if I use examples in her life that I know that she would understand, if I talk about characters that maybe she knows from a book or something that some joint experience that we've had, then that's going to relate with her much more directly. And it would go, as Nelson Mandela says, if you talk to him in his own language, it goes directly to his heart. So an example or an exercise to practice bridging, when I'm talking with a live group, I like to use the example of using the room that we're in and bridging an explanation of the house that I live in to the room. And as I look around the room, I might say, when I walk in the front door of my house, there's a door, and I'll look at a door that's in the room, and I'll say, it's much like the door that's over here, except maybe it's a different color, maybe it's a different size, but I'm correlating something in my house to something in the room that they can see and that they can recognize. And I often say, when I walk in my house, there's a long wall that goes from the front of the house to the back of the house, and on that wall, there's a television. And if there's a television in the room I'm speaking, then I'll point to the television and say, it's much like this. So this is just an example of taking things that are of common context, so everybody that's in the room with me can see the things around the room, and I'm correlating those things or describing my house in reference to those things that are in the room, because I understand that's a common context for us both being in the room. So I'm using things that are outside of the audience context and bridging it to things that are within their context. The other thing that we can do for effective communication is, and this is really communication 101, is close that loop of communication. So if I have that idea, that thought, that image in my mind, and I'm going to communicate it with somebody else into their context, well, I'm going to use words and vocabulary and expression, and I will share my thoughts or my ideas with them. But you never really know how somebody else perceives it. You don't know if that message landed within their context. You don't know if the definitions and the comprehension of what you meant to say meant the same thing to that person. So one way to fix that is to ask them to repeat back what it was that you just said. And if they say, if you tell them 2 + 2 = 4, and they say 2 + 2 = 1 + 3, then you know that you didn't describe or didn't explain exactly what you intended or what you wanted to. But if you ask them what you said, and they come back and say that 2 + 2 = 4, and that's exactly what you meant to say, and how you thought or how you felt about what it was that you were saying, well, then you know that they understood, and you have effective communication, a greater chance for effective communication. The other thing that we can do is help expand somebody's context. And I often think of teaching or as learning. So I think of communication and learning as much the same. Communication I often think of as between two people. So if I'm communicating a thought or an idea with somebody else, that would more typically be thought of communication. But learning is really the same thing. We're taking content from outside of our context, whether it's from a book, whether it's from a movie, whether it's from a lecturer, and we're taking that content from outside of our context, and we're expanding our own context with it. So this is something that we can do when we're communicating our ideas with other people. If we have a message that we want to share, and we want them, to understand it, and we come to find out that maybe they've never taken an algebra class, maybe they've never gone fishing, they've never gone to Afghanistan, they've never been to Florida, and what we're sharing with them is outside of their context. Well, what we can do to help them understand that is to just continue to provide more content, more information. So the first time I took a calculus class, all of that was outside of my context. But the more I read through the book, the more exercises I did, the more lectures I attended, the more videos I watched, and different reference books I worked with, and tutors and mentors that I spoke with, those are all additional pieces of content that were adding to my context. And eventually, everything that was in that calculus book was a part of my context. So therefore, I was able to know, I was able to see it, understand it, perceive it, and remember it, because my context had grown. And when your context grows, then learning has occurred. Much like this image right here, I love it. Says the dog looks at his friend and says, "Did you know that when a cat wags its tail, it means something completely different?" So learning for this young puppy has occurred. He now knows something about cats that he didn't know before. I've seen a wonderful example of this in a movie, and this is a short scene from The 13th Warrior. When I think of expanding context, I think of things that are outside of our context initially, content that is outside of our context initially. And when we're exposed to it, like the information in the calculus book that I was exposed to, or the information, anybody who starts a new job that is something they've never done before, there's all these points of content, all these things that they don't know about that job, but they begin to learn it as they learn, or as they incorporate that new content, those new ideas, those new reference points into their individual context. And I love the way that it plays out in the scene. I'll kind of set it up for you. It's only a few minutes, but there is a scene where Antonio Banderas is taken captive, and he doesn't speak the same language as his captors. So initially, the way they'll show it in the scene is they'll have these captors speaking in a language that he doesn't understand. But as he's exposed to more of it, he starts to pick up these little pieces of content. And each time he learns a new word, or the definition or the reference of a new word, it adds a little piece to his content. And I love the way that they show this, because they'll interject, English words that the audience understands when you're watching the movie. They'll just start to drop them in, and then in greater frequency. And eventually, Antonio Banderas speaks the language because he's incorporated all those data points, all those content pieces into his context. And now the language of his captors is something that's within his context, so he understands it. And play a few seconds of this, or a few minutes.
never thought something I about veteran who is.
Jag vet inte. Kanske mån.
Well, bra.
Jag kommer ju spis. För när han var ung, vant han detta mål. Vad är det? För när han var
varit i Italien with? Nej, nicka där. Nej, nicka där.
Det follige vant han. Ingen kunde tro att man kan inte så lyve.
Dina rökhats.
Jag vet inte. Kanske tomorrow.
Nu ska du höra. Så en herre går på klipp. Will a sheep belong to snake up to steal teeth of 12 horses?
Så kommer det bästa. Då han ville gå, ropte han till dem.
Jag vet inte. Kanske vi kan find some geese.
So then he says, do not tell me wife, for I will get no supper when I come home tonight.
I don't sound like that. Run it slept through her while we took the horse.
No hard both of you. She probably was some smoke-collared camp girl. Looked like that one's mother.
My mother was a pure woman from a noble family, and I, at least, know who my father is. You.
So just a couple seconds, I just love the way that it shows there in that scene how all that language is outside of Antonio Banderas' context initially, but as he was exposed to more and more of it, each of those words in the vocabulary became a part of his context, so he was able to understand that. And it's no different than when we learn another language ourselves. We just expose ourselves to content in different ways to expand our context. But every time that we learn something new, we're simply incorporating new bits of content into our context. We're learning new memories, new ideas. And once our context expands, we can understand that much more completely. So, and if you're taking notes, and you jot those down. So effective communication, speak in their context. Use bridging, so use things that they do understand or they do know. Close the loop, so ask them to repeat what you said, and if it sounds the same as you intended it, or as you thought, or you meant it, well then, you know that effective communication is likely taking place. And lastly, if you need to communicate something outside of somebody's context, then find ways to expand their context. And there's some of the advanced things that we'll talk about. So why does this matter so much? Why is somebody that talks all about life enrichment, personal development, why am I spending so much time talking about communication? Usually I talk about service and charity and nonprofit work and leadership, but communication to me is a huge part of living a positive and a meaningful and an effective life. When you master content and context, it helps you not only understand yourself better, but it helps you understand and appreciate other people. When we look at somebody who's different than us, we can look at their context. Think back to the context mapping. We can look at the context mapping. We can look at the experiences. We look at what they know, and we can understand them better if we look at the experiences they've gone through in their life. And we can understand and appreciate them and their position and their beliefs and their thoughts and the things that they know and the things that they have to contribute. We can understand and appreciate that much more effectively. And then back to understanding ourselves, when we can look at the things that have transpired in our past and realize why it is that we think that we and know and believe the things that we do, and that helps us understand the way that we see the world and the way that we communicate with the world. When you can understand another person's context, it really helps you enjoy a relationship at a much different level or with much greater meaning. When you understand somebody else's context and can relate with them much more effectively and communicate with them much more effectively, then that really improves the quality and the meaning of the relationships. That's not just personal relationships, but also business relationships and relationships with any stranger that you might meet on the street. When you can understand their context, you can have a much more meaningful and deep relationship. And lastly, it helps us learn things more easily. Before I understood this concept of content and context, I might want to learn something new, and I'd pick up a book. If it was a calculus book, I'd pick up one calculus book and I would just pore over it and over it and over it. And for some reason, I'd get some of the content, but not other pieces of the content, and I'd get frustrated. Or trying to learn a new language is a perfect example. Many people, they'll find one modality for learning a new language and continually expose themselves to it and then just get frustrated because they're not picking it up. Well, if you can expose yourself from different angles, if you can introduce yourself to the content in different ways, maybe you need an online course, maybe you need a tutor, maybe you need a book, maybe you need to go travel to that country that speaks that language. All of these are different ways to interject that content into your context. And when you approach it from that angle, you look for different places to get more and more content, and realize that as your content, or as you incorporate more content into your context, that it will grow, and eventually your context will incorporate that entire language, that entire new concept that you're trying to learn. You can learn things more easily and do it with much less frustration and effort. So this is this is kind of the real reason why I'm so passionate about talking about content and context. I believe, I know that everybody acts and does things for primarily the same reasons. We all individually want the same things. We all want happiness. We all want to feel like we're making a contribution. We all want to feel safe. We want to feel like our needs are met. We want to express ourselves and feel like we're heard and we're understood. Everybody has those same needs. You think of Maslow's hierarchy of needs. Everybody has those same needs, and we're all seeking the same thing in return. We just have different ways of going about it. And the things that we think and the things that we say and the things that we believe is just a product of our individual context. But we're all trying to seek the same thing. We're just trying to seek it in different ways. When you think of it that way, you can see how much more we have in common with everybody else and how much less actually divides us or makes us unique or different than other people. I believe that every person on this planet is simply a product of their nature and their nurture. One thing that's talked about a lot is whether we are, a product of, if everything that identifies, or every characteristic that we have is simply a product of our nature and our DNA and where we started out in life, or is it a nurture answer? Is it the experiences that we've had along the way, and is it the upbringing that we had and the things that we experienced and the things that we saw and the things that we learned? Are we nurtured into the person that we are? Well, I really believe it's a combination of the two. And with that, I also believe that I would be the exact same thing as anybody else, or that any of us would be the exact same product or the exact same thing as anybody else had we had their exact same nature and their exact same nurture. So if I was born in anybody else's shoes and I had all their exact same experiences in succession after my birth, I believe that I would see, understand, and relate to the world exactly the same as they did. If I was exposed to the exact same things, then my context would grow exactly the same as another person. And therefore, I have no difference really between myself and another person other than my context and the things that I know, see, and understand and believe about the world. When we can realize that and approach people with that understanding and relationships, then it really breaks down a lot of the barriers and a lot of the frustration and the separateness and the lack of community or the lack of bonding that I think prevents a lot of us from connecting more closely with those around us. So when we get this stuff wrong, when we get this content and context wrong, what are some of the consequences? The first thing is it destroys compassion for many of the reasons I just mentioned there. When you don't see somebody as much more similar to you, and when you think that you're different than somebody else, and you think that you wouldn't possibly be similar to them or think or face the same struggles and challenges that they did, unless your context was like them, and you realize that your context would be exactly like theirs had you experienced the same things, had you gone through the same hardships and faced the same challenges and had the same opportunities. When you realize that we're all the same and that we would all think, believe, feel, and say and act the same as another person, if we were a product of their nature and nurture, well, that really helps fuel compassion and understanding for other people. When we fail at that content and context, it breaks apart the human connection. When we're not communicating effectively, when we're misunderstanding or miscommunicating, when we're having that frustration and that stress and that those missed opportunities, it really breaks apart the connection that we have with other people who are very much like ourselves. when you're not communicating effectively and you think people are different than you, and you don't understand that they're simply a product of their individual context, and that can fuel judgment and hatred and ultimately violence against other people, because you're not seeing them for their context, you're seeing them for your own context. And when hatred and violence and judgment are fueled, that leads to more pain, more suffering, and more isolation for everybody. And that isolation continues to break down. And as I say here, that erode the very fabric of relationships. That pain, that suffering, that isolation is what breaks us apart and what separates people in their relationships and amongst families and amongst communities. And the more that we fail at the content and context, the more we'll continue to erode those relationships and the fabric of the families and the communities and the people that we interact and bond with. Fortunately, when we learn to master this content and context and really understand it and speak into other people's context and help them grow their context and see them as a product of their context, not as something that's right, wrong, or indifferent, just as a product of their perspective and their relative values and their understanding of the world. When we can see people of that light, it really helps breed compassion. Now we're judging somebody on the product or on the basis of their context and their experiences and what they've seen and what they've done and what they know about the world and about life. We see them through their own eyes much more effectively, much more easily. And when we can do that, it really helps strengthen bonds and connections between us and other people. When we can see other people as a product of their context and we can understand the way that they see the world, and that helps bring us closer and fuels that connection. And when we come closer together and when we feel that connection, that just fosters more understanding, more appreciation, more sympathy, and our ability to care for one another and to understand one another. And I think that when we come together more closely, when we bond, when we break down those points of divide and learn to communicate more effectively, not suffer from miscommunication and frustration, then it can cure most of the pain and the suffering that we know. We're very social people. We need interaction. We need interaction with others to live a happy and fulfilling and a meaningful life. And when we break that down because we're not communicating effectively, that creates that pain and suffering. But when we can master content and context, when we can communicate more effectively, it really cures the source of most of that pain and suffering. And lastly, it's really the fabric of all relationships, our ability to communicate. As I said in the very beginning, communication, there's nothing that defines or influences our life more than our communication. That's communication with ourselves, communications with others, everybody that we communicate with at work and in the community and in our families. That communication defines the experiences that we have and the relationships and the bonds that we have. And when you can communicate more effectively, when you really understand content and context, then it strengthens that fabric of the relationships, the families, and the communities. I love this quote here by Abraham Lincoln, and there's some controversy whether or not he actually said this, but I believe that he did. And it says, "I don't like that man. I must get to know him better." And when I hear this, I think exactly of content and context. If I don't like somebody else, it's because I might not understand their context. If I don't like the way that somebody's acting or the way that they think or the things that they believe, it's because I don't likely understand what their context is. What experiences have they had along their life? What books have they read? What mentors have they had? What schools have they gone to? And if I can understand that more clearly, then my chance of frustration or of judgment or of fear or of hatred is really alleviated, because when I can see the world through his eyes or her eyes, then I get to know them much better and diffuse that tendency towards fear, towards judgment. So if we don't like somebody, I think it's because we don't understand why it is that they act in a certain way or why it is that they believe certain things. As Mr. Rogers says, how sad is it that we give up on people who are just like us? If we're all just a product of our own nature and our nurture, and we all just see and interact with the world because of our individual context, and we could be the same as anybody else if we had their same context, then how sad is that we get frustrated and we give up on people who are no different than we would be had we lived their same life experience and had we developed the same context that they have? How sad is that we give up on others who are just like us? Another thing that he said is, frankly, there isn't anybody that you couldn't learn to love once you've heard their story, once you understand how their context comes together. once you understand why it is that they see and they relate with the world, once you understand the pains that they've suffered and the opportunities that they've succeeded at, and the way that they see, they understand the perceptions they have, the comprehensions they have, and the way that they remember their world and their life. Once you've heard that story, then there isn't anybody that you couldn't learn to love and appreciate once you know them and once you understand their context. And lastly, this quote by Albert Einstein. He says, "Peace cannot be kept by force. It can only be achieved by understanding." We can't keep peace. We can't create peace. We can't cultivate peace amongst nations or amongst individuals, amongst friends or amongst enemies. We can't create peace by force. You can't force somebody to have your same context. You can't force somebody to believe the same things that you do. The only way that we can really create peace and truly create peace is by understanding other people for who they are and for the context that they have and for the nature and the nurture. Because once we can understand them, then we can see the world as they do, and we lose that ability to judge another person, lose that fuel for the hatred and the violence. So a couple advanced topics about content and context, and these are things I won't really have a chance to cover in depth right now, but one thing to remember is that your context is elastic. So not only does it change over time as you have new experiences and as you learn new things, but our context is also influenced by many things. It's influenced by our own emotional state. It's influenced by just kind of the way that we show up, the emotions that we have, the emotional responses that we have. If you're well rested, if you're well nourished, your context is going to be one way. If you hear something or you experience something, you're going to perceive it one way. Whereas if you're in a different stress state or a different emotional state or a different point in your day, maybe you're tired and fatigued, but at the end of the day, your context is going to change a little bit. The way that you see, perceive, and understand things is going to change a little bit. So understanding that somebody's context is going to change over time, and it's not always exactly the same, and understanding that your own context is going to change is important. It's elastic. It's not something that's fixed. And not only does your context grow as you learn new things, but your context also shrinks in certain areas as you forget things from your past, or as you learn new things, you might replace pieces of content that previously defined your context. So just remember that your context isn't fixed. Not only does it grow, but it can mold and change in different ways. Another thing about context is assumption bias. So sometimes we'll perceive something and believe that it means a certain thing, and then through our context, through our individual context, we'll see or understand it in a certain way. Or we might, if we're receiving communication, we might think that something means a certain thing based on our context. And then because of that assumption that we make, or because of that bias that we have towards the things that we know, see, and understand, we might perceive that message in one way when actually it was intended or meant to say something different. Here's a quick little cartoon. The wife, it looks like the wife says that you never listen to me, you only hear what you want to hear. To which the man responds, sure, I'll have a beer. So he perceived, or he thought that what the message might be was something about that. But I'm sure everybody can remember a time where they're expecting a certain answer or a certain bit of information, a certain communication. And because they were assuming that certain communication, they heard it and it wasn't actually true, or it wasn't actually the same thing. Happens a lot with our names. Sometimes we'll hear something that sounds like our name and we'll think that somebody said our name, and we'll look around and realize that somebody said our name. It's just the sounds that we heard. We assumed that it was somebody speaking our name when in fact it wasn't. Another thing is redefining your context. So the things that we see, the things that we experience, the things that we hear have a certain meaning to us when we hear them. I remember one time I was sitting on the beach, and I was selling real estate at the time, and I hadn't taken a day off in a while, and I was kind of getting frustrated because my phone was ringing, or there's always something I had to answer to. And I was getting a little frustrated after a few hours on the beach because I couldn't even catch a few minutes of time without my phone buzzing or dinging or some new message or some new email coming in. So in my mind, I was frustrated because every time my phone dinged, it would create a negative emotional response in me because I saw it a certain way. So kind of, somewhat clever, I guess, humorously, I decided, instead of allowing myself to think that it's something bad that happens when that phone dings, then maybe I'll just pretend for a moment that every time that phone dings, that something good just happened to somebody around the world. Maybe somebody just won a lottery ticket, or somebody just got an A on a test. Well, it's funny because I purposely did that. I knew I was kind of just messing with my context or the way that I perceive things, but right away, the next time my phone dinged, instead of getting frustrated and upset, I simply smiled and had a good positive emotion. So I didn't want to have that negative emotion when I heard my phone go off. So I told myself, jokingly told myself that it meant something different, and the response that I had was something completely different. So kind of a little game to play, but if you're experiencing something that means something bad or it's creating a bad emotional experience, then think of something else that you can tell yourself. Nothing else. Maybe you'll get a smile out of it. Another thing we can do when we're trying to talk with somebody or share content with somebody and it's outside of their context, is we can pre-package that context. And what I mean by pre-packaging is there's a lot of information that somebody doesn't know and it's all outside of their context. Well, if you can provide the context of that content, I think that's a way that we would normally talk about it. Like, tell me more of the context. Then we can share, kind of pre-package that content that we need to share with them. So if I wanted to tell somebody a story about something that happened between two friends of mine, and the person I was relating this message to, this content to, they didn't know my friends, they didn't know the situation. Well, then I could say, let me tell you a little bit of the history behind so-and-so, or about this situation, or let me tell you why this was significant or this wasn't significant. I'm taking that content, that message that I want to share, and I'm pre-packaging it with other things just to make sure that it makes sense. If I were to say, if the content that I wanted to share with you was the number 1, and I were to say 1, well, that would have a little bit of a meaning, but you wouldn't really understand what exactly it was that I was saying. But if I pre-package that with some other bits of information, maybe instead of just saying 1, I said 911. Well, by saying 911, that's going to kind of complete your picture, or your understanding, or your comprehension of what it is I'm trying to say, because I provided extra content to come along with that message 1. I could take that same number 1, and instead of saying 911, I could say 90210, and that would give you a completely different perception or understanding. I would communicate something completely different to you with that prepackaged content. So the prepackaged content would be the backstory that you're sharing, or the amplifying information that you're sharing. If I wanted to tell somebody about an experience that I had in a plane and they weren't a pilot, well, I'd have to do a lot more explaining. I'd have to prepackage some content and explain in greater detail what the significance of the message that I was trying to share. The last topic that I'll mention real quickly is the story that you tell. Many times things will happen to us and it creates a certain response, and that response that we have is related to the story that we're telling ourselves about that response. And this kind of correlates to the story that I told myself when my phone buzzed on the beach. I told myself that it was one more person that was trying to get a hold of me and wouldn't let me have a few minutes of peace to myself, enjoying my time on the beach. But when I changed that story about what was shared, then it meant something completely different. If you're having a frustrating situation with somebody, and you're telling them, you're telling yourself that the situation or the things that they're saying means one thing, well, you could easily tell yourself a different story. And one of my mentors, I love Jack Canfield, he talks about if, the story that we tell ourselves. So he says, for example, say a woman's birthday has come up, or a couple's anniversary has come up, and the husband or the friend forgot about the birthday. Well, one story that you could tell yourself is, he doesn't love me, or they don't love me, and I don't mean anything to them, and I'm not significant, and this event isn't significant, so therefore I don't mean much. That's one story that you could tell yourself, and I'm sure the emotional response that you would have from telling yourself that story would not be a positive emotional response. You wouldn't, you wouldn't feel the feelings, you wouldn't think the thoughts that you'd want to feel and think. It wouldn't be in a positive way. It wouldn't be anything that would help the relationship by any means, or help you enjoy your day if it was a special day. What if instead you told yourself the story, not he forgot or they forgot my birthday or this special anniversary, but so therefore they don't love me. But what if you told yourself, somebody who loves me, who cares a lot about me, and who I mean a lot to, forgot my birthday? And then thought to yourself, what are some of the reasons? So instead of saying, instead of filling in the blanks of the content and saying, somebody forgot my birthday, therefore they don't love me and they don't appreciate me. If you change that story and said, instead, somebody who loves and appreciates me forgot my birthday, well, it leads your emotional response on a completely different path, and it leads your imagination and the thoughts that you have on a completely different path. Now you can have one of concern or compassion, and not jump to that conclusion that the story, the reason behind the event, behind the message that was shared is something bad or something positive. If a friend gives you some kind of some, not criticism, but feedback, and it's taken in a negative way, one story that you could tell yourself was that, that friend's telling me there's something wrong with me because they don't like me, or they don't appreciate me, or they're judging me, or they think they're better than me. That's one story that you could tell yourself. Another story is you could say, wow, my friend really cares about me, therefore they were looking out for me, and they want the best for me, and they want the best for my life, so therefore they had the courage to share something with me that might very well help me, or help make my future, my tomorrow better. In that second story, you're coming from a place of compassion and understanding, and you're not jumping to the conclusion that somebody was judging you or had something negative intended to say. We don't have too much time for questions, but I'm always open to them. And if anybody has a question about this, I'll provide my email address in a couple slides. And if something comes up now, or you have a question about this presentation, or a question comes to mind, or a thought comes to mind in the future, then please, by all means, send me an email, or you can reach out to me on Facebook, and I'd love to continue the conversation and continue to communicate about this content and context. I do have a couple of announcements. So one recent thing, as I said, I'm trying to find new technologies and new ways to share these ideas and these conversations with more people. And one thing that I've done is started to create some online courses. So I recently launched this one page on my website, and if you go to the web URL at the top, the online.garrettbiss.com, it will redirect you to this page here where I have some online courses. I've loaded in the books that I have, so if you're interested in purchasing one of my books or have a friend that is, you can go to this website and you can download the ebooks, and there's also a way on there that you can click and I'll send you a print copy if you prefer. And then the first course, I'm creating some online courses, and the first one is called the 7-Day Happiness Kickstart. And it's a really neat course where I go through for 7 days or through 7 modules, and I share some of the most powerful tools and techniques that you can use in your life, or that anybody can use in their life, to experience much greater happiness and sensations of fulfillment. Some really simple things that you can do. I share a message in a few minutes a day, and then give you a little exercise, and the really simple things that you can do to bring much greater happiness into your life. Maybe you're at a place where you need a little boost of happiness. There's certainly things in this course that you'll learn that will help provide that. Or maybe if you're at a better place in your life and you just want to take your happiness up a notch, then there's definitely things that I share that will help you do that. Really help you create some good habits to fulfill that happiness, or to be in a more positive place more often and when you need it the most. So you can go to that website, you can find that. This is kind of what the course looks like if you're interested. This is just a preview of one of the videos. So for each of the 7 days, I share a different video. This is an example of.
Welcome to day 5 of the 7-Day Happiness Kickstart. If you've been going through the lessons and applying some of these principles that we've talked about so far and doing the exercise, I know you're experiencing a big impact and a major change in your life. And I'm sure that you're experiencing some greater sensations of happiness and joy and gratitude and fulfillment in your own life, just from these simple things that we've covered so far. So I congratulate you for going through the different lessons each day. And I'm really excited about the concept that we'll talk about today. I'm so excited about this. It's actually something I wrote a whole book on. So the spheres approach of happiness and fulfillment was really derived from this one concept, or this one lesson. So have you ever had a period of time in your life where there were a lot of things weighing on your mind, like too many things, and it was just, frustrations and anxiety and stressors and too many projects on your plate and different things happening at work and things that we were hearing about on the news that were just frustrating or scaring you or bringing some anxiety or more stress into your life? I had a period of time like that in 2013 when I was deployed to Afghanistan. I was going through a difficult chapter in my life, and there were also a lot of things that were taking place and a lot of things that I was aware of or hearing about that were influencing and affecting the way that I felt. And what I noticed, though, is that there were a lot of things that I was conscious of and a lot of things I was hearing about and that were on my mind that didn't directly affect my life. For example, I heard a lot of things on the news about train derailments and factory explosions and tragedies happening in different parts of the world, and all this was weighing on me and affecting the way that I felt. But I realized that none of these things directly influenced or affected my life. And when I realized that, I made a conscious shift to focus.
So that's a quick preview of my last course. And then the other announcement is that the next course that I'm going to create is an online mastery course just dealing with and talking about this content and context. So it's currently under development, and I'll have some more information on that soon. But I'm really excited to expound upon everything that we mentioned or talked about during this presentation and help a lot of people master these concepts of content and context and really improve our ability to communicate with ourselves and communicate with other people. So that's something that's in the works, and I'll be excitedly sharing some information on that in the very near future. But for everybody that was on this webinar, I wanted to provide an opportunity to invest in that and to have that content and that material when it comes available. These are some of the things that we'll talk about: content and context, redefining that the way that we just talked about, and then how to maximize your communication ability. We'll go more deeply into those advanced topics when I talk about the different ways to improve it. There's a lot of tools that I have that I can share on how to improve your communication ability in reference to content and context. Some worksheets that we'll go through. So like the content mapping exercise and some of those other exercises, little worksheets that you can go through and really learn and master and incorporate these concepts or these principles into your life. In the online course, I actually go through each of these topics and I break down much more in depth in each module so that you can, if there's a concept that you don't remember or want to refresh on, you can go back to that specific module and just refresh that idea, that information. And for the online course, what's great about it, you have lifetime access, 24/7. You can go on there at any time and relearn or readdress some of these things. But for everybody that's on this webinar call, I don't want you to have to delay in your exposure to this content and context. So assuming that this recording works well, I believe it will, I'm going to load a recording of this specific webinar up to the course website. So if anybody wants to have access to it right away, I'll provide that and make that available for anybody who wants to invest in the course. Because it's not complete, I don't know what the price is going to be. It's going to be somewhere between $97 and $149 for the online course once it's complete. But for anybody that wants to invest in it now and have access to this webinar right away, I'll do a special deal, just $25, which I'll leave open for the next 24 hours. I had to load it up to my website, and I don't want everybody to be able to go on there and jump on it. So I'm kind of giving you a heads up. If you're on this webinar, you're watching this webinar, you can jump over there and purchase it right now for just $25, and I'll upload this webinar recording so you have immediate access to it, and you can reference this as the rest of the course is built out. And then when the full course goes online, the $100 or $149 value full course goes online, then of course you'll have lifetime access to that. But this is a little thank you that I have just for joining me on this webinar, and want to share my appreciation and allow you to jump into these topics much more in depth as soon as you are ready. So I'll provide a link to this where you can go and register with the URL so you can get it at this special price. But I'll only leave that up for the next 24 hours. Like I said, I don't want the public to be able to jump on that URL and find this special deal. So I'll just leave it up for a short period of time. But if you're interested and you want to learn some more, then I'll make it available to you. You can go check it out. And so the 7-day happiness kickstart. So if you're interested in that, I've created a coupon code for anybody that was on this webinar. It's SAVE80. So SAVE80. If you do that, then that'll knock 80% off the happiness kickstart. You can have access to that. And it's regular price $97, but you get it for less than $20. And you'll be able to go through each of those 7 modules and learn 7 of the most powerful tools and techniques to bring greater happiness and joy into your life at a much discounted price. So SAVE80 if you're interested. You can go to that website. It's online.garrettbiz.com, and you can check that out right now. And I think that's it for announcements. And please, as I said, send any questions that you have. You can find me on my website. You can find me on social media, and you can send an email to garrett@garrettbiz.com anytime if you want to continue this conversation or ask about anything else that I'm doing or have any other thoughts or things that you'd like to share. But I really appreciate your time on this webinar, and I'm excited to connect with you again in the future and share some more ideas. But hope you have an awesome evening. Sorry we ran over just a couple of minutes, but have an awesome evening. I had a great time spending this last hour and a half with you online. So have a great one. I look forward to connecting soon.